Dear listener, welcome to this calm and unhurried journey through history here on the Histovale channel. We sincerely hope you are finding full rest in this late hour of the night. Now, let us enter that quiet chapter of history.
The final decades of the 18th century in the newly formed United States were a period defined not merely by grand pronouncements of liberty and self-governance, but by the far more tedious yet equally essential challenge of administration. After the ratification of the Constitution, the fledgling federal government, headquartered first in New York and then in Philadelphia, found itself confronted by a foundational and immediate necessity. It simply did not possess a reliable, standardized system for cataloging its own populace or its burgeoning economic activities. The need for a uniform mechanism of record-keeping was not born of idealistic fervor or intellectual curiosity, but rather from the grim, practical realities of modern governance, taxation, and representation. The framers had inscribed in the foundational document the requirement for an enumeration of the people every 10 years, a mandate established primarily to apportion seats in the House of Representatives. This was the directive known to every schoolchild, yet the implementation of this initial decree, the very mechanics of how this immense, scattered, and often distrustful populace was to be counted, represented the first complex administrative hurdle. The resulting legislation, the Census Act of 1790, was a sparse document, yet its passage signaled the federal government's first major attempt to project its administrative authority into the previously autonomous domains of the state and local governments. This attempt was, by its very nature, preliminary, and the network that emerged from it was largely unintended. The act itself designated the United States Marshals, officers primarily charged with judicial enforcement, as the central figures in this monumental data collection effort. The choice was pragmatic, driven by the fact that the Marshals possessed a defined jurisdiction and a nascent, though often skeletal, local infrastructure in nearly every established county. The Marshals, in turn, were instructed to employ a cadre of assistant enumerators. These assistants were the true foot soldiers of the statistical campaign, men often chosen from the ranks of local magistrates, county clerks, or prominent citizens whose primary qualification was usually their willingness to undertake the exhaustive and often thankless task for a meager per capita remuneration. This system immediately introduced an element of non-uniformity into the very heart of the standardized directive. Consider for a moment the simple document itself. The form specified by Congress was exceptionally brief, focusing on 5 rudimentary categories. The head of the family was to be recorded by name, and then the members of the household were to be categorized. Free white males aged 16 years and upward, including heads of families, free white males under 16 years, free white females, including heads of families, all other free persons, and slaves. This was the extent of the initial federal statistical appetite. The profound simplicity of the question stands in stark contrast to the methodological complexity of their collection. The assistant enumerator was required to travel through their assigned subdivision, moving on foot, by horse, or by rudimentary conveyance, and personally record the data. There was no central repository of pre-printed forms. The enumerators were frequently required to hand copy or even hand draw the required template onto whatever available paper could be procured locally, using ink often made from gall nuts or soot and quills susceptible to frequent snapping. The inevitable consequence of this decentralized production was a fundamental inconsistency in the physical artifacts of the census. A schedule returned from Massachusetts might be neat, organized, and written on smooth imported paper, while a corresponding schedule from a frontier county in Georgia might be a rougher scroll, panned haphazardly on thick, coarse paper, its columns drawn freehand, and its ink faded from exposure to the elements during transport. The preliminary directive called for uniformity, yet the inherent limitations of the period's infrastructure of documentation ensured that the records themselves were wildly divergent in their material nature. Beyond the census, the burgeoning Treasury Department, under the methodical and demanding guidance of Alexander Hamilton, sought its own data. While the census provided a demographic count, the Treasury required economic intelligence, specifically data on foreign trade to assess the viability and effectiveness of new tariff and exile laws. This involved directives to the nascent network of customs collectors situated in port towns along the coastline. Unlike the temporary census enumerators, the customs collectors were permanent federal appointees, tasked with recording the precise nature and value of goods entering and exiting American ports. Hamilton's directives to these collectors were rigorous and specified a granular level of detail regarding the commodities. The forms required were often intricate, demanding the classification of imports down to specific types of textiles, raw materials, or manufactured goods. The required level of precision vastly exceeded that of the demographic census. However, this administrative rigor was again met by the logistical hurdles of the young nation. Customs collectors, sometimes operating in relative isolation in smaller, distant ports, often lacked the clerical support necessary to maintain the fastidious daily ledgers required by the Secretary of the Treasury. The quarterly returns they were mandated to submit to Philadelphia were frequently late, incomplete, or filled with abbreviations and non-standardized units of measurement reflecting the local mercantile practices rather than the centralized requirements of the Treasury. The system was therefore defined by a constant low-level friction between mandate and implementation. Congressional directives specified what was to be recorded, but the lack of a substantial nationwide postal or bureaucratic service meant that how the recording was done was left to the often idiosyncratic discretion of local officials. The marshals and collectors, though technically federal agents, were men rooted deeply in their local communities, often sympathetic to, or perhaps merely compliant with, local customs and prevailing political sentiment. The directive for uniform record-keeping was thus filtered through hundreds of individual interpretations, regional dialects, and varying levels of administrative competence. This initial administrative effort was not a clean, seamless deployment of authority. It was rather a patchwork of paper trails, connected by the slow, rhythmic movement of postal riders and packet ships. The network was not designed with the clean, logical geometry of a modern organizational chart, but emerged organically from the cumulative weight of individual compliance. The unintended consequence of the congressional mandate for uniformity was not instant standardization, but rather the establishment of a precedent for inquiry. The government had asserted its right to ask questions, and for the first time had put in place the procedural steps, however clumsy, to systematically gather answers. The decade of 1790 to 1800 must therefore be viewed not as a period of administrative success, but one of bureaucratic apprenticeship. The data collected was, by modern standards, incomplete and riddled with inconsistencies. Yet the essential, dull, and procedurally necessary apparatus had been erected. The paper had been specified, the officials had been appointed, and the long, slow, dry process of accumulating national statistical habit had begun. The network, unintended in its fractured reality, had nevertheless woven the first tentative threads of federal data infrastructure across the vast and decentralized landscape of the early American Republic. The quiet hum of record-keeping, slow and constant, had commenced.
The early years of the 19th century introduced a profound administrative necessity to the American experiment, the imperative to quantify its own economic engine. Following the initial, rudimentary demographic counts of the 1790 census, the focus shifted from counting people to measuring production. This shift was driven by the Treasury Department, which, under the leadership of Albert Gallatin, recognized that the stability of federal finance depended entirely upon the predictable flow of revenue, and that revenue, in turn, depended upon the accurate documentation of agrarian output. The vast majority of federal income derived from tariffs levied on imported goods, making the tracking of exports, the goods that financed imports, a critical statistical exercise. The challenge was immense: to convert the irregular, sprawling, and inconsistent yield of millions of scattered fields into the uniform, predictable entries of the centralized ledger. This period, stretching from the Louisiana Purchase to the era of good feelings, was marked by the gradual yet persistent imposition of bureaucratic requirements upon local commercial practice. The federal government had little capacity to survey production at its source. It could not send agents to every farm or plantation. Instead, the administrative strategy focused intensely on the points of aggregation, the ports of export. The customs collector became the central figure in this documentation effort, transitioning from a mere tax assessor to a critical cog in the national statistical machinery. The directives issued from the Treasury in Washington were explicit, yet their execution encountered immediate and persistent hurdles related to measurement inconsistency. The various agricultural commodities, cotton, tobacco, rice, and salted provisions, were handled and packaged using highly decentralized regional standards. For instance, the weight of a bale of cotton, the foundational unit of Southern commerce, varied considerably. A bale pressed in the interior of Georgia might weigh significantly less than one pressed at a major port like Charleston, where superior hydraulic machinery was employed. Similarly, a hogshead of tobacco, the standard container, had volumes that fluctuated depending on the staves and carpentry available in a particular region of Virginia or Maryland. The Treasury's persistent demand, therefore, centered not merely on the quantity, but on the precise unit of measure. Gallatin and his administrative clerks mandated the universal adoption of the avoirdupois system for all official reports, requiring weights to be specified in pounds and tonnage, regardless of the volumetric container used by the shipper. This insistence created a continuous low-level administrative friction. The customs collectors were forced to hire local weighmasters and inspectors, often part-time employees, whose task was to translate the traditional, locally understood units, the hogshead, the barrel, the quintal, into the standardized federal units of pounds and tons. The collectors' handwritten quarterly reports, still preserved in the National Archives, are often filled with marginal notations detailing these necessary yet time-consuming unit conversions, a silent testament to the tedious effort required to create statistical uniformity. The primary documentary instrument in this translation process was the bill of lading, or the ship's manifest. When a planter or mercantile factor delivered a consignment of goods to the port, the transaction immediately generated paper. The bill of lading, a triplicate document, served as both receipt and legal contract. The federal interest lay in its required columns, which included the name of the shipper, the destination, the vessel's name, and, crucially, the itemized list of goods and their measured weight. The customs collector, or his appointed clerk, was required to certify this document, comparing the stated weight against the physical weighing conducted on the docks. This mandated procedural step ensured that the quantity data was captured at the final point of domestic aggregation before international shipment. This physical paper trail was then aggregated into the collector's port ledger, a large bound book maintained by the collector's clerk. This ledger became the source material for the quarterly reports sent to Washington. The entries were made by hand, often in the cursive script of the era, requiring meticulous care to ensure the figures were aligned correctly across columns designated for declared value, weight in pounds, and commodity type. The tedious, repetitive action of transcribing hundreds, perhaps thousands of these individual entries into the official port book represented the crucial bridge connecting the reality of the field, the harvest, the pressing, the packaging, to the abstraction of the ledger in the capital. The logistical challenge of transporting this data across the expansive young republic further colored the process. The quarterly reports were often conveyed by the slow, often unreliable federal postal riders, or, where feasible, by coastal vessels traveling between major ports. A report detailing cotton shipments from Savannah might take weeks or even months to reach the desks of the Treasury clerks in Philadelphia or Washington. The resulting national commodity baseline was therefore always retrospective, compiled many months after the commodities themselves had been sold in Liverpool or Le Havre. This temporal lag, the slow process of the paper catching up to the cargo, is a fundamental characteristic of the data of this era, introducing a soothing, predictable delay into the narrative of American commerce. By the second decade of the century, the constant accumulation of these uniform, if belated, reports yielded the first credible national commodity baselines. For the first time, the federal government possessed a reasonably reliable quantitative measure of the sheer volume of cotton bales, tobacco hogsheads, and grain barrels leaving its shores. This data, painstakingly gathered from the columns of collectors' ledgers, demonstrated the increasing and ultimately dangerous reliance of the national economy upon the single commodity of cotton. The continuous charting of these figures provided the necessary statistical foundation for geopolitical decisions, trade negotiations, and internal financial planning, lending an air of methodical stability to a political environment often characterized by volatile debate. The story of this period is not found in dramatic legislative acts, but in the quiet, monotonous work of the clerical staff. It resides in the steady scratching of the quill pen across the wide-lined page of the ledger book, in the slow rhythmic turning of the crank of the weigh scale on the humid docks, and in the patient procedural effort to reconcile the uneven outputs of the field with the demanding symmetrical requirements of the ledger. This systematic documentation, born of fiscal necessity and sustained by bureaucratic persistence, formed the invisible, stabilizing architecture of the American economy, establishing a rhythm of record-keeping that continues, in far more advanced forms, to this very day.
As the young republic transitioned into the 1820s, the administrative focus shifted from simple enumeration and export tracking to the far more intricate challenge of managing internal growth. The nation was expanding westward at an accelerating pace, driven by a steady stream of migrants seeking new agricultural land. This demographic sprawl created an urgent, structural problem: how to efficiently connect the emerging population centers in the interior with the established mercantile ports on the coast. The solution was not found purely in engineering prowess, but in the methodical, precise application of bureaucratic data. The story of infrastructure development in this decade is the story of correlation, of meticulously mapping the movement of people against the feasibility of physical space. The foundation for this new administrative architecture lay in the expanded scope of the census. By the time the enumerators took the field for the censuses of 1820 and 1830, the inquiries had moved beyond the mere tally of inhabitants required for representation. The government now sought a clearer picture of the nation's productive capacity and social stratification. New columns were added to the federal schedules, demanding data on the number of persons engaged in agriculture, commerce, and manufactures. Furthermore, the inclusion of statistics on pauperism and foreign residents added layers of social complexity. This administrative expansion meant that the resulting data provided not just where a community resided, but what its economic purpose was. This enhanced granularity allowed planners to identify emerging nodes of productivity, communities whose growth justified the massive expenditure required for internal improvements. Simultaneously, a distinct yet interconnected bureaucratic effort was systematically imposing a geometrical framework upon the Western landscape, the Public Land Survey System, PLSS. Managed by the General Land Office, GLO,
This process involved teams of surveyors moving into territories like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, armed with compasses, chains, and official instructions. Their task was the methodical, rigorous documentation of physical space. They were required to establish principal meridians and baselines from which the land would be subdivided into 6-mile square townships and further into 36 sections. The surveyor's work was the epitome of dry, procedural diligence. They meticulously recorded the bearing and distance of every section line, documented the species of witness trees used to mark corners, and noted the topography, water features, and soil quality. Every measurement, every observation was immediately committed to an official field notebook and transferred onto a plat map, a technical, detailed drawing that transformed the wild, fluid reality of the frontier into a predictable, measurable grid of paper. These plat maps were the bureaucratic language of the land, detailing the precise longitude and latitude coordinates of every potential property line and waterway crossing. The true moment of bureaucratic correlation occurred within the federal offices in Washington and the state capitals like Albany, New York, or Columbus, Ohio. Here, the demographic data from the census, the enumeration of heads of families, the count of farmers and artisans, was conceptually overlaid onto the precise topographical data provided by the GLO plat maps. This fusion of two distinct administrative streams, the human count and the land measurement, formed the justification for nearly every major canal and turnpike project of the decade. The logic was methodical. A proposed route for a canal could only be justified if the census data proved that it would intersect or pass near a sufficient concentration of productive population whose future needs guaranteed a return on investment through tolls and commerce. For example, reports justifying the construction of key segments of the national road or extensions of the Erie Canal network often contain two types of evidence. First, census tables demonstrating the exponential growth rates of settlements along the intended corridor. For example, population growth in Monroe County, New York between 1810 and 1820. And second, surveyors' charts detailing the elevations, soil composition, and drainage patterns along the exact proposed path, verifying its physical feasibility. The War Department, which played an early key role in funding and surveying internal improvements, maintained a vast archive of these comparative documents. The routine involved the production of lengthy reports filled with intricate charts and appendices. A typical report on internal improvements from this era would feature columns listing counties, their population totals, their professional demographics, the number of millers, tanners, and merchants, followed immediately by corresponding appendices detailing the precise topographical gradients and cost estimates for excavating or grading the land. The administrative burden was relentless and repetitive. The surveyors had to ensure their chain measurements were accurate to prevent disputes over rights of way. The GLO clerks had to ensure the plat maps were meticulously transcribed to prevent land title errors. And the Treasury clerks had to ensure the census figures were accurately aggregated to prevent political challenges to the distribution of federal funding. This system of checks and documentation created a self-reinforcing loop. Population growth created the need for infrastructure, and the methodical, bureaucratic documentation of that growth provided the means to finance and physically locate the construction. By 1830, the administrative habit of data correlation was firmly entrenched. The bureaucracy of growth was not an emergency measure. It was a quiet, continuous administrative function that physically re-engineered the American landscape. It was the patient process of taking a column of numbers representing people, overlaying it onto a map gridded with surveyed lines, and using that composite document as the unassailable statistical justification for the digging of a canal or the laying of a turnpike. This process, dry and procedural as it was, successfully married the fluid reality of human movement to the fixed requirements of governance, creating the interconnected physical network that would define the American economy for the remainder of the century. The decade spanning from 1831 to 1840 marked a subtle but profound conceptual shift in the American administrative state. The preceding 40 years had been defined by the Herculean practical labor of data collection, the simple act of counting heads, measuring commodities, and surveying land. By the Jacksonian era, the bureaucratic mechanism for gathering data, however imperfect, was established. The new challenge was one of analysis and interpretation. The government was now drowning in ledgers, manifests, and census schedules, and the administrative necessity became the development of a coherent statistical methodology to translate this raw information into actionable policy. This endeavor immediately encountered what can be termed the paradox of precision, the realization that the increasingly sophisticated mathematical manipulation occurring in the federal offices was being applied to source data whose collection remained fundamentally non-uniform and often reliant on estimation. The data itself was a patchwork, but the resulting calculations, the averages, the ratios, and the rates of change, yielded precise-sounding decimal figures. The administrative culture was beginning to prize the precision of the calculation over the inherent roughness of the empirical input. The 1840 census provided the crucible for this shift. It was the first enumeration that truly attempted to capture the nation's rapidly diversifying economy with a high degree of detail. The schedules were expanded to include intricate questions about manufacturing output, the value of textiles produced, the quantity of iron forged, and detailed classifications of occupations, seeking to define the productive capacity of the population beyond mere agricultural output. The clerical staff at the Treasury and the newly organized statistical sections of Congress were immediately confronted with a problem of tabulation complexity. No longer was the work a simple tally. The new imperative was comparison. Clerks were required to engage in repetitive, methodical calculations across vast tables of figures. The raw number of people employed in manufacturing in a given county had to be divided by the total population of that county to yield a ratio of industrial engagement. The increase in cotton production between 1830 and 1840 had to be subjected to subtraction and then division to determine the decennial growth rate, often expressed to 2 or 3 decimal places. This patient arithmetical labor, performed by hundreds of individuals using nothing more than ink, paper, and basic arithmetic rules, represented the quiet, true dawn of American statistical science. The methodology relied heavily on the concept of the mean, or the national average. To calculate the average wage of a laborer, for instance, clerks would aggregate all reported income figures and divide by the number of laborers reported, a process repeated across dozens of states and territories. This calculated mean, once published in an official Treasury report, became an established fixed point, a statistical anchor for policy debate. Yet this methodology inherently obscured the massive regional deviation, the difference between the wages in Boston versus a frontier town in Michigan. The administrative convenience of the single, precise average superseded the need to fully convey the messy complexity of the underlying data. This new statistical capacity directly impacted the era's most contentious economic debates, particularly the ongoing conflicts over the national bank and tariff policy. Proponents of protectionist tariffs, for example, began to rely heavily on reports that presented calculated ratios of domestic versus foreign manufactured goods. They used these ratios to argue that American industry was, on average, still too small or too fragile to withstand foreign competition. Conversely, opponents of the Bank of the United States used calculated rates of currency fluctuation and regional loan averages derived from painstaking analysis of bank reports to bolster their arguments about centralized financial control and economic inequality. The administrative process of generating these policy-influencing numbers was systematic and multi-layered. Raw data was collected by the marshals in the field, often rough. That rough data was then sent to Washington, where it was transcribed into bound official ledgers. These transcriptions were then used by specialized clerks to create abstract tables, which were then subjected to the repetitive cycles of calculation: division, multiplication, subtraction. The final result was a printed report to Congress, where the numbers appeared stripped of their messy local origins, presented with the authority and neatness of mathematical precision. This elevation of the calculated figure over the collected figure is the central feature of the decade. The statistical bureaucracy was not being dishonest, but it was demonstrating a faith in arithmetic that sometimes exceeded the quality of the original information. The very act of calculating the average wage to 3 decimal places, for instance, $0.783 per day, lent an air of unassailable empirical truth to a figure that was, in reality, derived from disparate local estimates, inconsistent reporting, and wide regional variation. The policymakers, needing clarity, were happy to accept the clarity provided by the precise, quiet finality of the calculation. The period from 1831 to 1840 cemented the administrative importance of the statistical report as a tool of government. It was the decade where the slow, dry rhythm of data analysis became as critical as the initial rhythm of data collection. The legacy of this era is the permanent establishment of a bureaucratic segment dedicated not just to filing papers, but to mathematically transforming them. The paradox remained. Policy was shaped by numbers that were exquisitely precise in their calculation, yet fundamentally approximate in their origin. A quiet, systematic contradiction that nevertheless provided the essential quantitative framework for the nation's economic future.
This long and detailed discussion of American history slowly comes to an end right here. We hope that this quiet narration has helped your mind find rest and has made your sleep even deeper and more comfortable. To listen to another dull yet important chapter from the pages of history on a future night, you may follow the channel. May every one of your nights be tranquil and restful. Good night.